The arrival. In September, the bay freshens and the tourists go back to the cities, and there are days when the eagles come back and the air smells of burnt things and things beginning to die. These are days when heaven can wait, and there are men in the woods practicing their guns, and on such a day as if the shotgun blasts reverberating from Half-Bush Island to Caitlin's Point were fireworks for the dispossessed, the lonely, and those who have only just come home. Walter Rath and Catherine Gray sailed their white yawl by the head and through the channel and into Sneed's Harbor. She would stay and have her child there, and they would stay longer, and their child would go to school there, and after a while, they sailed down the coast on the yawl less. They weren't the sort of people ever to say they were happy, for whispers of the gods and retribution, but others said it for them and of them, as if the little village past the channel had landed a special prize. She went by Charlie. People had always called her Charlie. The computers and all of it had reached the village, and it wasn't long before who Walter Rath was known, and nods went his way and Charlie's. She was pregnant then, and that was part of it too. She was even prettier when she was pregnant, which was saying something, it was said, though there was no one at the post office or in the store who'd seen her when she wasn't. She was fit and wore all the gifts, and her honey hair had the girls of Sneed's talking of salons they would never see. Even her posture, the way she held tall carrying that child, as if it was weight she'd been born for. And in the store, they talked of Walter Rath's money. No one knew, and it was all a guess. Once you talked in millions or billions, it was all the same anyway. Words lost their gravity and floated by. Not a little envy was stirred, or it could have been plain dirt fear, that he would take his marbles back west or buy up the town, or his cronies would come in and the prices of everything would go up. The cronies never arrived, and then there came the thought that Walter Rath didn't have them, that he was some kind of lone gunner from a world where there were things stronger and bigger than guns. The truth in any of it was that Walter Rath had gone out there when the valley was young, and when there were boys still in their garages, and there had been no one in a suit and a tie who picked the winners better than he did. He'd picked jobs and more than a couple of others, and then he was on television, the honored guest, the sage of San Jose, and punters in Duluth or Tallahassee would tune in to listen to who he was touting next. Then he was done with all of it, so that he was gone almost before the whole thing was up and running crazy big and spoken of with reverence. He was an early one. He'd left money on the table, and he'd met Charlie by then, who'd been around the valley herself and with some of the boys too, in her own fashion, the it girl of the valley for a while, and they'd both had enough. He bought the Concordia in Monterey Bay where it was rare, and they sailed until they couldn't or wouldn't anymore. When they saw Sneed's Harbor on the chart, Charlie said, "What a funny name." They put the boy in the school that had 7 in his class, and 5 of them were girls. The school was on the common with the Civil War monument and those of the elms that had survived the elm plague, and it was white clapboards like the house they bought 2 blocks away. Soon after the house, they bought the old summer camp on the bay that was 220 acres, and she went out there to ride and sculpt. The camp was at the edge of the town. It had broken buildings from when it was the summer camp, and ghost stories faint in the walls. It was the boy's favorite place. He would get lost in the spruce woods, and Charlie would yell before it was dark, and each time, every time, he followed his mother's voice out. The way it started with Walter Rath in the town was that he would go in the store and sit at the table by the back by the sodas with his chimes. There were 5 stools at the counter where the men of Sneed sat, and occasionally Doris Bunting too. They could swivel around and get a casual look at him, and he could see them, but he would never take their stools, it being a question equally of respect and calculation. And they never read the Times. The joke about the tourists who came all the way past Bar Harbor in the summer being that if they had to have their Times, they could just go back to New York where they came from. But Rath hadn't come in summer, nor had he been in New York, not lately anyway, except to sail the white yawl up the East River and under the bridges and out into the Sound, the city as a sweet little detour. and his Times came by mail a day late. Maggie Lassiter, who had the store after Ed Lassiter keeled over, so it was said from too many of her French fries, made naughty acquaintance of Rath when he dropped $1 in the jar each time he paid. Neither too little nor too much, which was Walter Rath's way. Bob Pierce had a conversation with Rath about PVC versus copper that impressed Bob for the man's practicality, as opposed, say, to the summer people over in Hancock or Winter Harbor, who Bob had heard about from the plumbers over there, and who put copper in no matter what, because copper was copper, and who cared what it cost. Cal Bowden at the boatyard dreamed fever dreams of getting his hands on the Concordia. When Rath sailed it over to Northeast for winter storage, you could say Cal was not amused. But then there was always something to unamuse Cal Bowden, and one day Rath stopped in to buy a case of Yamalube and was even-natured and spent the time of day, and Cal came back to his fevered dreams of the white yawl, if now situated somewhere over the rainbow. Others had pleasant, measured experiences as well, at the post office, in the red and white, and it was by such undramatic encounters, where nothing exceptional could be pointed to or made gossip, that Walter Rath seeped into the capillaries of Sneed's Harbor, such that by Christmas he and Charlie were lighting candles on Church Street, bundled against the wind chill with all the rest. Soon after, there were townspeople unafraid, if they saw him in the store and their Mac had frozen or died or the screen was the blue of the ocean, to ask him for his help. These were not things Walter Rath knew about, but he never failed to be regretful and saying sorry in his low, sad voice. And so Walter and Charlie were special in Sneed's Harbor, and the more so for not seeming it. They were Walter and Charlie, who baked breads for the church fairs and drove the seniors to the polls and manned booths on the 4th of July and be counted on to give for the ambulance and the library and the preschool enrichment and whatever else, but not so much that they would take captive these things that were properly of the town in whole. In their 5th year in Sneed's Harbor, about the time the boy entered the school, Walter was elected to the Board of Selectmen. Still, no one ever called him Walt. That was the book's opening chapter. I thought what I would do, there are really 3 sets of stakeholders in this book. There's Walter and Charlie's kind of the main couple, the very center of the narration of the story. The town folk of Sneed's Harbor, and then there are their invitees. I thought I'd read a bit now about the townsfolk. The talk of the town. Maggie Lassiter would tell anyone who asked what she thought. Anyone, that is, with the obvious exceptions of Walter and Charlie. When the rumor reached the store, by way of Donnie Cormer, that the Raths were going to pay to bring up young delinquents from New York City for what amounted, when all was said and done, to summer camp, Maggie felt at once that this had to be a situation where, despite their best intentions, and nobody was going to deny their best intentions, but still, the Raths were trying to work out their grief at the expense of good sense and the village. It would be one thing if they wanted to pay to have these people go to a summer camp close to New York City, but why bring them all the way up to Sneed's Harbor? She tried to remember so she could quote it from Mrs. Rundle's old history class about bringing coals to Newcastle. Once she was able to halfway state it, Doris Bunting pointed out that it did not apply, and in fact meant almost the complete opposite of what Maggie was thinking. Otherwise, Doris found herself in some agreement with Maggie, in that these people would probably feel less alienated and possibly even homesick, so far from home. Just imagine, for example, if you took Cal Bowden or Ryan Worsley, some of those who'd never been farther than Bangor in their life, and suddenly sent them to summer camp in New York City, when they were younger, of course, but how would they react? Herbert Fallows went further than either of the women, and suggested there might even be some animosity being expressed here, though he wouldn't want to say by whom, and up till now he'd been a big fan of the Raths. Along the same lines, one of the lobstermen, Tim Frobisher, wanted to know exactly what they were trying to prove. Nothing, They were trying to prove nothing, Frances McVeigh replied. They were only trying to honor something Stephen wanted. That's how she read the situation. And by invoking the boy's name, a boy who went to the school and grew up in Sneads with hardly an unkind word ever said about him, she hoped she would turn the tide of apprehension that seemed to be developing in the void created by the lack of real facts. There were others of the pro-persuasion in the store, for example, Carrie Michaud, who cut hair on the Clarkswood Road and who pointed out that for what she heard it would only be 2 weeks, and you can live with anything for 2 weeks. And Pat Morris, the town's all-purpose massage therapist, yoga instructor, and part-time red and white sales associate, who simply felt that, in general, everyone should stop being so nitpicky and at least wait to see what developed. Wait to see what develops, Bob Pierce said, and by then it could be too late. At minimum, he suggested, you should be finding the proper authorities in New York to inquire if they were going to be sending up any murderers. In fact, he'd do it himself. He'd figure out who to call, which would probably take all week, which he didn't really have to spare, inasmuch as the Canover's septic required an immediate 100% replacement, but he intended to do it regardless. Murderers, everyone agreed, would be going too far. If Gallup had bothered to poll the town, they would probably have found it fairly evenly divided, like someone who parts his hair down the middle in an antique style. Harry Casey, who was considered by some the village radical, or possibly libertarian, and who had once run decades previously and unsuccessfully for the state assembly as a peace candidate, pointed out that not only did the camp belong to the Raths and they should be able to do what they wanted on it, but if you remembered your Sneads Harbor history, you would see the beautiful irony that in the year 1895 or thereabouts, there had been a hotel resort situated in what were now the backwoods of the Raths camp. And that hotel had a housekeeping staff of black people, which you could see pictures of at the Historical Society, showing 10 of them in their uniforms. It was thought to be the only time so large a contingent of black people had lived in Sneads. Emily Thompson said she'd seen those photographs, and they were quite touching, and the Raths were wonderful people to be doing this, and Sneads ought to be doing its part to help out with the national problem. This quieted the discussion for a few minutes. No one felt up to arguing with Em, though privately there were those who felt she had gone a bit mad since Graham passed and left her $1.5 million of untaxed lobster profits. Great expectations. It looked like Goshen to Tyrell as he peered out from the back seat of the Suburban at green fields and low green rises and woods, his nose sometimes pressed against the glass and sometimes not. The flight up on a little commuter plane had not been his delight. Only 5 of them had been on a plane before, and of the rest a handful got sick, and Tyrell was one of those. He was starting to feel better now. The air outside the airport wasn't like air he knew, but he had gulped it in and wondered and got in the Suburban and kept his eyes on the horizon, because that's what the driver told him to do. Frank was driving the Suburban. To Tyrell he looked weird enough, with his scruff and his lank, and he was enthusiastic and pointing things out. He seemed a little weird as well, because there wasn't much to see, more fields and more trees. Tyrell had spent 9 months in Goshen Reformatory, while his mama missed him and he missed her, which was more than he could say for the streets of his native borough, which got him to Goshen, and now had got him here. The roads were slow and 2-lane. They were hardly big enough to call roads. The other boys were kicking each other and talking the usual trash to each other, but Tyrell kept his face on the glass and his eyes on the horizon because he was trying to feel better, but also because when you stutter, it's easier to think straight than talk straight. They passed a gun shop that said Maine Military. They passed a stale bread place and parking lots, and Tyrell, who had stolen 1 or 2 and not been caught for it, noticed that there weren't many cars. There were more pickup trucks than cars. It was like a movie that way, a buddy movie with a white guy and a black guy in a truck going 100. But the trucks he saw up here were going slow, like they were hunting for something. He thought of the gun shop again. Maine military, the insinuation of its name. Tyrell was an optimist by nature, willing to give the most unpromising circumstances the benefit of the doubt. But one bottom line in his thinking was that he was against the idea of getting shot at, and for that, it didn't matter where he was. An hour later, when they pulled into the Rath's camp, Tyrell could see that too had certain resemblances to Goshen, the chief difference being, in his initial estimate, that Goshen had a lot more of everything. Goshen had every sort of field, baseball, football, and expansive courts. All Tyrell could see here was one court. Life lessons as well told him to look around for guards, but there weren't any, nor any fences either. It occurred to him the possibility that there could still be some lasers in the woods that you wouldn't see until you stepped on them. Rigoberto could not say he was a big fan of lobster the first time he tried to eat one. Frank explained how the locals did it, but it seemed like a lot of work, and overall more parts of it that you couldn't eat than you could, including the green slime inside that reminded Rigoberto of guacamole that had been sitting in the refrigerator too long. The meat was sweet, but it left a sweet stink on your fingers that wouldn't come off even with the handy wipes, and the plastic bib was simply ridiculous. With a picture of a lobster on it, Rigoberto wasn't sure if it was a party favor or something you were really expected to wear. A rather proud individual in his everyday life, he felt he hadn't come all this way to be humiliated, and the same really with the champagne. Rigoberto knew all about champagne, from Bond films he'd seen and similar, but the truth was that he had never tasted it, not the French kind anyway. Not the $40 bottle kind. And he would have spit it out when no one was looking right under the table, but he felt he was too proud and too well brought up for that. Instead, he drank it as if he were lost on a desert island somewhere, drinking his own urine to survive. The hot fudge sundaes were fine, though. To make up for the rest of it, he ate 3 of those. You could have as many as you wanted. Then Sharon got up for the welcome wagon part of the evening. Rigoberto may have been bored by then, but he was a big fan of Sharon. Having a decent appreciation of his own talents, he felt a reciprocal appreciation of her, or seeming to have recognized them. As well, around juvenile detention, she had the reputation more or less of an angel, insofar as you might be almost on the bus to Rikers or upstate, and she could walk into the courtroom and talk to the judge and DA, and 10 minutes later you'd be walking on the street. These were no mean considerations, so we tried to listen to what she was saying, which had to do with the great privilege these people up here had for hosting all of them, and so they could forget about everything else in the past and home and everything, because for 2 weeks they were the kings and princes and whatnot, and if the staff could do anything to help, or they needed anything, only just ask. All of this information made a rather startling impression on Rigoberto's mind, especially the part, if he heard it right, about it being the Anglo's privilege and not his for him to be there. But right in the middle of all that Sharon was saying about the staff helping and only having to ask, Rigoberto received a text from his little sister back home, with the emoji of a cat's wide smile, and what Liddy messaged was, "Just be careful up there," to which he'd linked a story from not too far in the past about the governor of the exact state where Rigoberto happened to find himself. And what this governor was saying was that the drug dealers were coming up to his state from Connecticut and New York with names like DeMoney and Smoothie and Shifty. Those type of guys, the governor said. His precise words, they come up, they sell their heroin, they go back home, and half the time they impregnate a young white girl before they leave, which was a real sad thing because then there'd be another issue they'd have to deal with down the road. So, in Rigoberto's mind, this rather contradicted the welcome wagon theory of everything. When it came to the question and answer time, he asked Sharon about what the governor had said, which he read out loud so that everybody could hear. No shortage of obscenities rained down on the governor then, though the champagne dampened some reactions into mocking and sarcastic laughs that hollowed out the room. No one seemed more pissed and upset than Sharon, who gritted her teeth and acted like she hadn't had this information before, and for a moment Rigoberto was even afraid she was pissed at him for bringing it up and spoiling the party. But it wasn't that. It was only her surprise, which was almost more an awakening than really a surprise. She said she would look into it, and then Rigoberto was pleased with himself for bringing it to her attention. I'll stop here. Those are the stakeholders chiefly in Land of Cockaigne. Much else happens, some of which is alluded to here, and much of which is not. Hope you'll enjoy the book.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for doing this.